Have you ever walked into a place you built with your own hands, only to realize you no longer exist there? Not a dream, not a philosophical metaphor, but a raw, undeniable truth. You're standing there, flesh and blood, and yet you're treated like you're invisible simply because your appearance doesn't match the standard others have imposed. This isn't a story about some wealthy boss throwing a tantrum after being disrespected. This is about a man 50 years old, seasoned, successful, returning to his own creation, a 5-star hotel he poured sweat and blood into building, only to be treated like a stranger, someone unworthy of service. No one knew who he was, no one cared, until the truth came to light and the very system that seemed untouchable began to crumble. If you think power is the only thing that makes people listen, then maybe you've never seen what truth can do when it's used at the right moment. This is the story of Malcolm Hayes, and you won't believe what happened next. Have you ever walked into a place where you once poured your whole heart into building only to feel like a ghost no one can see? That's what Malcolm Hayes, age 50, felt as he stepped into the grand lobby of Sovereign Suites, one of the most luxurious hotels in a chain he had built with sweat, sacrifice, and an unwavering belief in excellence. But today, he wasn't arriving as the founder. No tailored suit, no assistants, no VIP treatment or deferential stares. Just a middle-aged man in an ordinary coat, dragging a worn suitcase behind him, standing quietly at the front desk like any other guest. Truth be told, Malcolm didn't have to be there. He could have called the executive team, ordered an internal audit, or hired an outside firm to investigate the growing complaints. But he knew better. Some truths only reveal themselves when the person at the center of it all sees it with his own eyes. He had heard the reports too many times. Black guests being ignored, confirmed bookings suddenly missing, cold, dismissive service with no explanation. And he knew emails and spreadsheets only showed the polished surface. He needed the truth raw and unfiltered. And it began to reveal itself the moment he approached the front desk. Tiffany Blake, a blonde woman in her early 20s, was manning the reception. She didn't even bother to look up. Eyes glued to her phone, her face was blank, bordering on indifferent. Malcolm waited, calm and patient. A gentle cough, no reaction. A light tap on the granite counter. Still nothing, just the soft swiping of a touchscreen. Finally, he spoke. "Excuse me, I have a reservation under the name Malcolm Hayes." Tiffany looked up, not with professionalism, but with the annoyed confusion of someone interrupted from a midday nap. No greeting, no smile. Just a flat, unimpressed, a lazy shrug. She turned to her computer, tapping the keyboard with disinterest. Without even glancing back at him, she said, "Not seeing your name in the system." Malcolm raised an eyebrow slightly. "Would you mind checking one more time?" His voice remained kind but firm. Tiffany let out a loud, performative sigh, the kind used to express not inconvenience but attitude. She typed a bit more, slowly, as though granting a favor. Then she declared, "Still nothing. Maybe you booked the wrong hotel?" Malcolm smiled, gently. "I didn't. I have the confirmation right here." He held out his phone, the screen glowing with a clearly displayed reservation code. She barely glanced at it. "Yeah, emails can be wrong sometimes. Our system probably hasn't updated yet." Malcolm didn't need to check the system. He built it, personally oversaw its development, a system that didn't delete confirmed bookings unless a staff member deliberately removed them. He had seen this before, too many times. A glance, a split-second judgment, then erasure. Not in words, but in eyes, in body language, in deliberate indifference. As if someone like him, black, without a title, without the glitz, didn't meet the unspoken standard to even belong on their list of guests. Malcolm took a slow, steady breath. No anger, no raised voice, because he hadn't come here to argue. He came to open eyes, and Tiffany had just helped him begin exactly the way he needed. Malcolm Hayes stood still. His eyes were soft, but his gaze deep, deliberate, followed Tiffany's every dismissive movement behind the front desk. The air around him seemed to slow, not because of time, but because of that cold, familiar sensation creeping into each breath, the kind you learn to live with, and eventually, to see coming. He'd seen this before, lived through it, overcome it. But what troubled him now wasn't the carelessness of one young receptionist. It was the system behind her, the one that allowed this attitude to grow unchecked, like weeds in a garden no one bothered to tend. And today, he had come to pull the weeds out by the root. Without a word, Malcolm gently tapped his phone screen, opening an internal management app accessible only to senior executives within the company. A few simple swipes, and his reservation appeared in full detail. Confirmation number, assigned room, and one critical line. Reservation manually deleted at 10:04 a.m. Actioned by Tiffany Blake. He didn't flinch. He simply nodded as if confirming what he already knew. His silence made the space around them heavier, more difficult to ignore. "Miss Tiffany," he said quietly, his voice calm and low. "May I ask you something?" She flinched slightly, but her face remained cold. "Yes?" The reply was short, clipped, and clearly annoyed. "Typically," he began, "when a reservation is deleted from the system, does the staff member need to provide a reason?" Tiffany raised an eyebrow, suddenly guarded. "Reception staff can delete bookings as long as they have access. No reason required, at least not if the guest hasn't checked in yet." Malcolm nodded slowly. "And you have that access, don't you?" She blinked. "Yes, I'm on the morning shift." He raised his phone and turned the screen toward her. The timeline was clear. The name of the internal account that had executed the deletion hers. For the first time since he'd entered the building, her composure slipped. A flicker of panic passed through her eyes. I don't really remember. Maybe it was a system error." "It wasn't the system," Malcolm cut in, still calm, still composed. "I know it. I built it." Tiffany froze, as if someone had pulled back the curtain and let daylight fall directly onto the lie she was trying to hide. "You looked at me," he continued, "and within the first second you decided I didn't belong here. You didn't need to double-check. You didn't need confirmation. All you needed was a feeling, and that feeling told you I wasn't worth your time. It wasn't an accusation, it wasn't an attack. It was a truth spoken with such directness and grace that it couldn't be denied." Tiffany muttered something under her breath. Malcolm didn't catch it and didn't need to. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, but as if granting her a moment to reflect, not to feel shame, but to recognize. "Sometimes prejudice doesn't need words," he said softly. "All it takes is a glance, and the stroke of a key." Then he stepped back, leaving the system screen open on the counter, the proof in plain sight. And between them, a silence so heavy, it no longer felt like two people, but one holding position, and the other holding integrity. The game had just begun, but Malcolm Hayes hadn't come here to lose. The lobby of the hotel remained wrapped in its usual cold, luxurious silence, but something about the atmosphere had quietly shifted. As Malcolm Hayes slowly walked toward the elevator behind him, Tiffany still stood at the desk, her hand resting unconsciously on the counter, eyes frozen on the screen that exposed an undeniable truth. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew he had planted a seed, not yet for redemption, but enough to make someone reconsider the consequences of what once seemed like a harmless action. When the elevator doors opened, Malcolm didn't press the button for the top floor, the floor reserved for the real VIPs. Instead, he selected level 7, the floor of the management office. Not because he sought conflict, but because truth, if not brought to the right place at the right time, was no different from a buried seed that would never see the light. In just a few minutes, he was standing before a door bearing a nameplate. Branch Executive Director, Douglas Cray. He didn't knock. The salt and pepper-haired director had just lifted his head when he froze at the sight of the man standing before him. Malcolm Hayes, a name not unfamiliar, but never expected in a moment like this. No secretary had called ahead, no appointment was scheduled, just a presence. And Douglas, with his years of experience, knew instantly this wasn't a visit of formality. It was a reckoning. "Mr. Hayes?" Douglas stood up abruptly, forcing a polite smile. "What a surprise." "We need to talk," Malcolm replied, his voice calm but carrying weight like thunder rumbling low before a storm. Douglas nodded, gesturing to a seat, trying to steady himself by pouring 2 glasses of water, one for his guest, one for himself. His hands trembled slightly. "Is there an issue at the front desk?" he asked carefully. Malcolm placed his phone on the desk, screen facing up, the internal log still open with the name Tiffany Blake and the reservation deletion clearly displayed. No explanation needed. Douglas stared at it, breath held. 1 second, then 2. And in that pause he understood there would be no way to deny this. I sincerely apologize for this incident," Douglas began, trying to steer the conversation into safer waters. "Surely it must have been a misunderstanding, possibly a system—" "Douglas," Malcolm interrupted, gently but with no room for argument. I didn't come here to hear about the system. I came to understand how an employee can manually delete a guest's reservation without detection. And why this pattern of behavior keeps appearing in the same branch: guest complaints, discriminatory treatment, denied service. Her name shows up in nearly every report I've read this past week. Douglas opened his mouth, but Malcolm's gaze silenced him. In those eyes was the patience of a man who had witnessed far too many disappointments, and now he would not allow a single excuse more. "The question isn't what did she do, Douglas," Malcolm said. "The question is, why did you allow it to continue?" The branch director lowered his head, not just in fear but in recognition. This was the line, and the man sitting across from him was no stranger. He was the one who had laid the first brick of this empire, back when it was just a cluster of coastal hotels with a dream. "Mr. Hayes, he stammered, then finally admitted in a whisper, "I was wrong." Malcolm nodded slowly, and for the first time in the conversation, allowed himself a small smile, not out of forgiveness, but because at last, the truth had been called by its name. "Then fix it, Douglas, not with an apology, but with action." And with that, he stood, leaving behind a silence heavy with consequence, but also cracked open with possibility. A door had opened for truth, for reform, and for rebuilding a foundation not painted in luxury, but anchored in honesty and responsibility. Malcolm's empire hadn't crumbled because of a front desk clerk, but it would be recalibrated starting in the very place that had forgotten this simple truth. Service is not a favor, it is a matter of ethics. Malcolm Hayes left the branch director's office without another word. The door closed softly behind him. No sound, no drama, but to Douglas Cray, still frozen behind his desk, that silence rang like a warning bell, the kind that signals a coming reckoning. In the elevator ride back to the lobby, Malcolm remained quiet, but his mind was already moving at the pace of a seasoned strategist. He wasn't angry. He didn't need to be. Anger leads to loss of control, and Malcolm had come here to reclaim control. As the elevator doors slid open, he walked calmly toward the front desk, where Tiffany Blake still stood, her face trying to remain composed, but her eyes betraying a quiet panic. She knew, or at the very least, she felt it from the moment he said his name out loud, Malcolm Hayes. But it wasn't the name that truly unsettled her. It was the slow realization that she had just disrespected a man who, as she now understood, was the very architect of the empire she stood in. Malcolm didn't look at Tiffany right away. He scanned the lobby, the few guests subtly watching, the other receptionists pretending to be busy, all of them waiting to see what the man would do next. Finally, he turned to Tiffany. His voice wasn't loud, it wasn't sharp, but every word landed with the precision of a needle piercing through the carefully worn mask she used when facing customers. "You know who I am now, don't you?" Tiffany nodded, her face pale, but Malcolm didn't wait for a reply. "Then you also know what you did, and what that says about the culture of service I spent my life trying to build." She stammered, I just thought you were a regular guest." Malcolm let out a quiet laugh, not amused, but hollow. "Regular? Sure, I looked regular. But the way you looked at me as if I was beneath you, invisible, that says a lot more about what's not regular here." Tiffany lowered her head, unable to speak. Malcolm shifted his gaze to the other staff, his eyes moving from face to face before he spoke again, not to her now, but to all of them. "I don't blame you for the mistakes of one person. But if you stand by and do nothing, if you ignore injustice, you become part of it." The lobby fell into silence. Not a silence of fear, but of reflection. A young employee, probably in his early 20s, stepped forward hesitantly. His name was Leo, a new hire Malcolm had quietly noticed earlier. There was still honesty in the boy's face, untouched by the system. Leo spoke, his voice low but clear. I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes. Not on anyone's behalf, just for myself. I've seen things like this before, and I stayed quiet. I promise. I won't anymore." Malcolm looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly, then nodded. That's all it takes to begin change. The air felt lighter. A few other staff members nodded, their expressions still uncertain but braver than before. They understood now this wasn't about one person. It was a rare moment to reset a culture that had quietly cracked from within. Malcolm said nothing more. He turned and walked away, leaving behind eyes that no longer looked at him with curiosity or condescension, but with respect, and something close to hope. A simple reminder can stir a wave. And Malcolm Hayes, the man who had quietly stepped back into the empire he once built, had just released the first wave. A wave that would not stop at the front desk, but rise steadily until it reached the highest floor of the entire operation. Malcolm Hayes didn't look back as he walked away from the reception area. He simply moved quietly toward the corridor leading to the VIP section, an area he had once poured his heart into designing, not just with the standard of luxury in mind, but with the soul of genuine care and dignity. But today, that space had become a wall dividing ideals from reality. A cold, indifferent reality where people like Tiffany Blake believed status could be measured by a suit or a skin tone. Stopping at the edge of the hallway where slanted light from the sconces painted shadows across the marble walls, Malcolm pulled out his phone. He wasn't in a rush. Every gesture was marked by a composed stillness, the kind of stillness that only comes from someone who had prepared for this moment his entire life. The call connected. "This is Hayes," he said. On the other end, a woman's voice answered, calm and professional. "Yes, Mr. Hayes, I'm here. I want a full audit of the Grand Orem branch. Everything from the past 3 months, complaints, guest feedback, internal disciplinary actions. I don't want a single piece of paper overlooked." There was a slight hesitation. "The full 3 months, sir? That will require the full team." "Exactly," he replied. "Notify quality control and loop in HR. I want a full operational review, not on paper, but real-world performance. If someone isn't fit, they're out of the system." A brief pause, then she replied gently, "Understood. I'll begin immediately." Malcolm ended the call, his eyes lingering on the golden edge of light tracing the ceiling. At 50, he had no need to prove power. What he sought now was renewal not just of a hotel branch, but of a belief system that once inspired him to build an empire. A few minutes later, when Malcolm returned to the lobby, subtle shifts were already underway. Staff whispered quietly, passing along what felt like a secret. Guests began murmuring, curious about the mysterious man who had just brought the whole management hierarchy to a standstill. Stephen Cray, the branch director with the polished smile and empty charm, was coming down the staircase from the mezzanine office. His charcoal suit was flawless, his tie perfectly knotted, but his posture gave him away. His steps lacked conviction, and in his eyes was fear. He saw Malcolm standing at the counter, calmly greeting an elderly guest. Stephen approached quickly, forcing a tight smile. "Mr. Hayes, I sincerely apologize for what happened. I had no idea." Malcolm raised a hand slightly to stop him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm, steady tone did more to expose Stephen than any outburst could. "Stephen," he said, "what I need is not an apology. What I need is a system that operates on accountability. What happened today isn't an incident, it's a symptom." Stephen swallowed hard. "I understand. I'll have them review all front desk procedures." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Review? Or check them for the first time?" Stephen was speechless. Malcolm looked him in the eye and said slowly, "I've ordered a full audit. If everything here matches what your reports claim, no one has anything to worry about. But if reality is nothing like the paperwork, then I'm afraid this office might be getting new leadership. A soft, final blow. Not a threat, but a truth. And for people like Stephen, silence was the heaviest judgment of all." As Malcolm turned and walked away, leaving Stephen frozen at the desk, several staff members exchanged glances no longer indifferent, but awakened. They understood. Today wasn't just about one person being unmasked. The sun outside the hotel's towering glass facade had begun to dip toward the horizon. Light spilled across the marble floor, glowing like a signal. The moment for change had come. And Malcolm Hayes, the man once dismissed as just another guest, was the one pulling back the curtain on a brand new chapter. Malcolm Hayes sat alone in the suite on the 20th floor, a room that once stood as a symbol of elegance, every detail drawn and designed by his own hand. The glow of sunset spilled through the glass, bathing the space in gold. It looked peaceful, but inside him, quiet waves of unrest were rising. The laptop in front of him wasn't for unwinding or checking routine emails. Its screen was lit with a long list of guest feedback pulled not from the public-facing customer service portal, but from a private, secure channel. A place where complaints were never made visible. A place where the truth had been hidden, buried, and manipulated. Names repeated themselves, most notably T. Blake, Tiffany Blake, front desk agent. Her name was logged in dozens of incidents, denying service to guests who didn't have the appropriate appearance, deliberately assigning lower-tier rooms to cause discomfort, openly mocking certain guests, or showing blatant disrespect. But every time, the issue was quietly dismissed under the label of misunderstanding. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood a trail of others, assistant managers, night shift HR reps, even maintenance staff people who had accidentally disrupted services only when the guest in question was black, underdressed, or simply didn't fit the image. Malcolm quietly typed a command, expanding the system's data pool. A map of the hotel's internal operations appeared, revealing blind spots in surveillance areas where the cameras conveniently lost connection at just the right times. There was no doubt now, this wasn't a series of operational oversights. This was a cultural rot, an entire ecosystem designed to subtly filter guests, uphold invisible privileges, and discriminate with precision. All of it happening inside the very empire he had built with care. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. A memory surfaced. His father, a black carpenter from rural Georgia, turned away from a hotel lobby in 1968 simply because he didn't fit the image. Malcolm had made a vow to himself long ago that one day he would build a place where people were welcomed for their worth, not their appearance. And now, that very place was betraying the promise he once made. A soft knock broke the silence. He opened his eyes. "Come in." A young employee stepped in, tablet in hand, face tense but respectful. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Jordan from Analytics. You requested HR data and the results of the anonymous internal surveys." Malcolm nodded. Jordan handed him the tablet and hesitated. I've worked here for almost 2 years, and what you're investigating, I've seen it. I just never had the courage to speak up." Malcolm looked directly at the young man. There was no ambition in his eyes, only a quiet guilt, a kind of guilt Malcolm knew well. "You just spoke up, Jordan, and that's the most important beginning." Jordan lowered his head, a quiet exhale of relief. Malcolm studied the data now glowing on the tablet screen. Internal reports showed that over 40% of staff at the Grand Orem branch felt unsafe speaking out against wrongdoing. Nearly 30% had witnessed discriminatory behavior but didn't know who to report it to. "I need your help compiling a list," Malcolm said, "of those who still believe in the original vision, people like you." Jordan nodded this time, with resolve. "I'll do it, Mr. Hayes." Malcolm offered a faint smile, then turned his gaze back to the window. Dusk had settled. The city lights had begun to flicker on windows glowing like small stars, signs of life, signs of hope. And he knew. This battle was never about removing Tiffany Blake. It was about reclaiming the soul of a place he had once poured his entire heart into. Starting tonight, the Grand Orem would no longer be a polished fortress for the privileged few. It would become a place where everyone was finally seen for who they truly are. When Malcolm Hayes stepped out of the elevator into the lobby of the Grand Orem the next morning, everything looked unchanged. Gleaming marble floors, glittering crystal chandeliers, well-dressed staff offering polite smiles to passing guests. But he knew just beneath the polished surface, cracks were spreading. He didn't need an escort, no prior notice. His presence today was intentional and fully prepared. Malcolm walked straight to the front desk where Tiffany Blake was stationed. She didn't recognize him, not yet. Her eyes skimmed over him as if he were just another ordinary guest. But unlike last time, this time, he didn't wait for her to speak. "Ms. Blake." Tiffany blinked, pausing briefly, then regained her professional posture. "Yes, sir? How may I help you?" Malcolm didn't smile. He simply held out a special staff ID card embossed with the title, Chairman, Hayes Hospitality Group. Her face went pale in an instant. "I think we need to have a conversation. Right now." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked toward a small conference room near the lobby where Jordan and 2 senior managers were already waiting. Tiffany followed, silently, each step heavy like a defendant walking into a private courtroom. The door closed behind them. The room fell quiet. Malcolm sat across from her, his expression no longer angry, just cold. The kind of cold that comes from someone who already knows the truth. "I won't take long," he began, voice steady. "The system logs all access, including actions erased from the primary history. Were you aware of that?" Tiffany said nothing. "I have confirmation logs showing you personally deleted my reservation. Not a glitch, not a mistake. And that's just the tip of the iceberg." He slid a folder across the table. She glanced at it. "Complaints, indirect audio recordings from guests, and written statements from coworkers who had shared shifts with her. No one spoke. Jordan quietly observed. One of the managers took notes. Tiffany swallowed hard. I didn't know who you were at the time. Malcolm cut her off, his voice low and even. You didn't need to know who I was. You only needed to care about how you were treating someone. And this time you picked the wrong person. A flicker of panic crossed her face. She tried to explain. I've been working here for 3 years. I never meant to hurt anyone. But you did, repeatedly, systematically. Malcolm stood, motioning to the senior manager beside him. Ms. Blake will be escorted off the premises. Her employment is terminated, effective immediately. She is permanently barred from working in any hotel under the Hayes Hospitality Group. Tiffany said nothing. She lowered her head and quietly exited the room. The door closed behind her with a finality that needed no echo. Jordan watched her go, then turned to Malcolm. Thank you for not staying silent like the ones before you. Malcolm simply nodded. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only the weight of having removed a symptom knowing full well the disease ran deeper. He turned to Jordan. Now we begin for real. I want a full list of every staff member flagged in complaints, along with a proposal to overhaul our hiring and evaluation protocols. And I want a system-wide equity training program mandatory. Jordan jotted notes quickly, eyes filled with renewed purpose. Malcolm stepped out of the meeting room and into the lobby again. A few staff members glanced at him, curious, hesitant, uncertain, but there were no more dismissive looks, no more contempt. He knew change was only just beginning, but this time the difference was clear. He was staying to finish the work himself. That morning, Grand Orem felt like it had just awakened from a long and uneasy dream. Everything appeared normal. Guests lined up for check-in. Staff offered polite bows with their practiced smiles, but no one moved with the same ease as before. Something in the air had shifted. A different kind of silence lingered, mixed with glances that were no longer indifferent but watchful, cautious. Word of Tiffany's termination had spread like a breeze. But what truly shook people was the revelation of the man's true identity from the night before. Malcolm Hayes, the founder of the entire hotel empire. And now, he was seated in a conference room on the 18th floor, across from 3 regional managers. His expression wasn't as cold as it had been yesterday, but his eyes remained thoughtful, deep, resolute. I didn't come here just to deal with an incident, he began, voice low and measured. I came to address how we've let this place rot from the inside. All eyes turned to him. Grand Orem isn't just made of marble and chandeliers. It stands for a belief that anyone who walks through its doors deserves to be treated with dignity. If we lose that, then nothing we've built means anything. A moment of silence followed. Then the man to his left, Darren Lee, branch manager from Chicago, spoke up. I'll admit, sometimes we focus too much on performance scores, booking numbers, revenue, and lost sight of the fact that people are the heart of it all. Malcolm nodded slightly. I made that mistake too. We built a system that prioritized profit over humanity, and now it's showing in the smallest of behaviors, in Tiffany's dismissive look, in Stephen Lane's silence. Darren looked down, ashamed. Malcolm pulled out a thick folder. He laid the documents out one by one, each a customer complaint. Guests denied rooms for being told it was fully booked, despite system availability. Others flagged for the way they spoke, the color of their skin, the clothes they wore. He paused at one particular file. A black guest in business attire had been asked for additional documents during check-in, something other guests weren't required to provide. This, he said, holding the page up, was the final drop that made me come here that night. The room held its breath. I don't want Grand Orem or any hotel that bears the Hayes name to be a place where someone feels invisible, Malcolm said, his gaze distant. Because I've been that man. I've stood at reception desks no one looked up from. I've been doubted, diminished, because I didn't fit someone's idea of belonging. His voice wasn't angry, it was heavy, soft but deep enough to reach the core of the room. And I made a vow that no one else would ever have to feel that way in the house I built with blood and dreams. No one spoke. The silence was thick, solemn. Angela Torres, the regional director for the Southwest, gently placed her hand on the files. I'll begin auditing every internal report, starting today. Darren added, I'll reorganize our diversity and sensitivity training, and this time, attendance won't be optional. Malcolm didn't smile, But he nodded. He knew this was only the beginning, a small one, but essential. Because real reform doesn't begin with firing one person. It starts with awareness, with individuals inside the system finally taking a hard look at themselves. The meeting ended in silence. But it wasn't a silence of fear, it was a silence filled with accountability, the kind that meant people had, at last, been awakened. And somewhere deep within Malcolm, for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir. Something that felt like belief. A quiet hope that this empire, one that had drifted so far from its course, was finally being pulled back by the very hands within it. That afternoon, sunlight streamed through the grand windows of the Grand Aurum, casting golden reflections across the polished leather chairs and red velvet carpeted hallways. But for those inside the high-level internal meeting room, the sunlight did nothing to ease the atmosphere. If anything, it only highlighted the rawness of a truth that had been conveniently ignored for far too long. Malcolm Hayes, the founder, was no longer just a distant symbol hanging in framed portraits across the lobby. He was there, in the flesh, and he carried the quiet command of a leader who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. Before him, the screen displayed charts, statistics, and projections, but the most important data wasn't on the screen. It was in the eyes of everyone in the room, unease, awareness, and fear. But Malcolm didn't judge them. He understood. Real change doesn't come from fear. It begins only when people are brave enough to look in the mirror and face themselves. Starting today, he said calmly but firmly, we'll conduct a full cultural audit across the entire system, not to punish, but to cleanse. One of the regional supervisors raised their hand slowly. You mean, we'll be reviewing individual staff behavior? Malcolm nodded. More specifically, how we make others feel when they walk through these doors. Silence. History won't remember those who were best at selling rooms, Malcolm continued. But it will remember those who had the courage to correct the course when they realized they'd gone astray. Grand Aurum doesn't need another star on a rating board. It needs to reclaim the reason it was founded in the first place, to be a place where people are treated with dignity no matter who they are. A moment later, Angela Torres spoke, her voice soft but steady. I propose we start by reviewing all room cancellations from the past 3 months. Cross-check them with internal records. Anyone who was turned away without a valid reason deserves to know why. Malcolm nodded. And we will reach out to each of them, not to pacify, but to apologize genuinely. The room nodded. Some began scribbling notes. Others furrowed brows at the weight of what lay ahead. But no one resisted. Everyone seemed to understand. This was long overdue. The meeting ended without applause, but the slow, heavy steps of those walking out of that room spoke louder than any celebration could. A reckoning had begun. That very evening, the hotel's automated system sent out a message titled simply, "A letter of apology from Grand Aurum." Inside was a note written personally by Malcolm. "We apologize if you ever walked into our hotel and did not feel welcomed as you should have been. That was our failure, and we are working to correct it not with promises but with action. Please allow us the chance to begin again." Within hours, hundreds of responses poured in. Some were surprised, others deeply moved, a few still angry, but most said the same thing. They could feel the sincerity. And that was the beginning Malcolm had hoped for. In his private suite at the top of the tower, he sat quietly, gazing out at the city as the lights flickered to life below. That glow reflected in his eyes, older now, but as sharp as ever. Because he knew, an empire is not truly built on marble and stone. It is built on honor. And today, after all these years, he had finally begun to rebuild it from the ground up. That morning, as the soft light of dawn spilled across the grand lobby of the Grand Aurum, everything appeared just as it always had, crystal chandeliers glimmering from high ceilings, the front desk pristine in its polished perfection, like a scene arranged to impress. But one thing was no longer the same: the atmosphere. It no longer carried the cold detachment that had filled the space when Malcolm Hayes first returned in silence. Gone were the guarded stares, the polite but hollow smiles used to mask arrogance and bias. Now Grand Aurum had truly come alive, not through its opulence, but through its essence, its people. Malcolm stepped out of the elevator. He didn't need to introduce himself. Everyone knew who he was. But what earned him respect wasn't his name, it was what he had done, holding the wrong accountable without vengeance. and giving second chances to those who chose to change. At the front desk, once the site of so many wounds, a group of new hires was being trained by none other than Angela Torres. No longer a passive observer, she now led with a blend of empathy and conviction because she had seen firsthand how truth could be buried beneath silence. "We don't welcome guests with procedures," Angela said, her voice steady. "We welcome them with respect," and everyone listened closely. Malcolm smiled. As he walked through the lobby, no one avoided his gaze anymore. On the contrary, heads nodded, smiles met his, and some even stepped forward to shake his hand, not because he was the owner, but because he was the man who listened when no one else would. That evening, a quiet reception was held in the cozy ballroom on the second floor, not to boast, but to give thanks. Formerly overlooked staff, guests who had once endured discrimination, all were invited. Malcolm stepped onto the small stage, holding no speech, no script, just a photograph, a snapshot from Grand Orum's grand opening in 1998. In it, a younger Malcolm stood proudly in front of his very first hotel, full of hope. Beneath it, handwritten words read, "A place where everyone belongs." "I once dreamed of a place like that," he began. "And then, I let it drift off course." He looked around not as a CEO, but as a man who had walked a long road and chose kindness as his final destination. But that dream never died. It only waited to be reawakened, not by one person, but by all of us, together. In that room, applause echoed not loud, but lasting. It was agreement, a vow, a shared promise not to let history repeat itself in silence. The next morning, a new post appeared on Grand Orum's official website with a simple title, "A New Promise." In it, Malcolm wrote, "We cannot erase the mistakes of the past, but we can and we will never repeat them. From this day forward, Grand Orum is not just the name of a hotel, it is the name of a promise, that anyone who walks through these doors, no matter who they are or where they come from, will be treated as the most worthy person in the world." And that was the day Grand Orum truly became a symbol not of luxury, but of a culture of equity that Malcolm Hayes had spent a lifetime rebuilding. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Malcolm stood alone on the top floor, gazing out at a city in motion. His heart was quiet, at peace, because he knew this time, the empire he had built could no longer be shaken, because it was built on truth, and there is no power stronger than that. As the glass doors of the hotel closed behind him, Malcolm Hayes didn't look back. He didn't need to, because now the eyes inside had changed. There was no more contempt, no more dismissive glances, only silence and respect. He never had to raise his voice to be heard, never had to lash out to reclaim justice. All he needed was one thing, truth undeniable, timely, and clear. Malcolm's story isn't just a wake-up call to those who judge others by appearance. It is a mirror, a reflection of a bitter truth, that in many places bias still hides behind routine. But when one person has the courage to stand up, truth becomes powerful enough to change the entire system. Malcolm didn't just reclaim his own dignity. He restored a broken structure with integrity and left behind a lesson that cannot be ignored. Never underestimate someone just because they are silent. Sometimes the quietest person is the one holding the key to change the entire game. If this story made you stop and think, share it. Because sometimes one story is all it takes to awaken an entire world.